We consider ourselves entitled to use our weapons against military facilities of those countries that allow their weapons to be used against our facilities. I recommend that the ruling elites of those countries that are hatching plans to use their military contingent against Russia seriously think about this.
The gravity of Vladimir Putin's warning cannot be understated. His statement brings the conflict beyond Ukraine's borders, framing it as a broader confrontation with Western powers. The rhetoric points to an increasingly volatile and unpredictable situation that has the world on edge.
So we wargamed this scenario, and we are right now on the escalation ladder, inching towards a nuclear war. It's not going to happen today or tomorrow, but the way that it happens, the Russians and the United States are de facto right now in a war. Why is that? It is because those attackers don't fire by themselves, even though a Ukrainian soldier technically can push the button, but the targeting of the weapon systems, ensuring that there's a proper flight trajectory of the missile, that it destroys the right target, the actual battle damage achieved that we wanted to achieve, it all requires U.S. personnel and U.S. satellites. This is why the Russians have stated that the United States and European targets are now in crosshairs.
Rebecca Koffler's stark analysis makes it clear that this is no longer a conventional proxy war. The involvement of U.S. technology and expertise places the United States directly in the path of Russian retaliation. Her words underline how close the world is to a tipping point of unimaginable proportions.
And every war game that we conducted back in the intelligence community ended up in a nuclear war. There was an escalation ladder, and the Russians have mapped that out in the course of 20 years, and we are on it right now.
Well, some supporters say, Ukraine has the right to defend itself, that it's just targeting Russian military sites that are attacking Ukraine, and this is perfectly legal and appropriate under international law.
Absolutely. From the standpoint of the laws of conflict, Ukraine is entitled to its defense, and this is what the United States has been doing. But there's a rational approach, and then there's an irrational, a senseless one.
This context adds to the urgency of the situation. While Ukraine's right to self-defense is supported by international law, the manner in which this defense is executed has far-reaching consequences. Koffler's concerns about rational versus senseless strategies resonate as the conflict escalates.
The Russians have suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties. Finland and Sweden are now NATO members, and Europe has been awakened from a post-Cold War slumber, more committed to defense than ever. So there's the potential here for a deal. It's going to be very challenging for the Trump team.
Despite the devastation, some positive developments have emerged. NATO expansion and renewed European defense commitments represent a shift in global power dynamics. These changes could provide leverage for negotiations, though the path to peace remains fraught with difficulties.
This is about topping the government so he can take control. That has been his motivation. He will never give up that aspiration. Even if there is a deal, Bill, he will violate it because he's violated every ceasefire in Ukraine previously and in Syria. And his aspiration, then he'll play the long game to take Ukraine eventually. So that's who we're dealing with.
General Jack Keene's analysis of Putin's long-term objectives is sobering. The Russian president's ambitions extend far beyond the battlefield, and any agreement would likely be temporary unless backed by strong enforcement mechanisms.
The two things that the Biden administration always said was that they didn't want a direct conflict with Russia, and they didn't want a nuclear war with Russia. And Putin has used that brinkmanship style to induce the Biden administration never to give Ukraine what they needed and when they needed it. This is ultimately a failure of the Biden administration's senseless as long as it takes strategy, which assumed we had an indefinite amount of time to reach a conclusion to this conflict.
The critique of U.S. strategy adds further complexity to the narrative. Hesitation and reactive measures have arguably prolonged the conflict, leaving Ukraine vulnerable and emboldening Putin's aggressive posture.
Well, hopefully, President Trump will come in and settle this. He is the only president that Putin fears, the only U.S. president, for multiple reasons. One of them is the Russian intelligence designated Trump as unpredictable, which means that when Trump negotiates, the Russians will not be able to tell whether he's bluffing or not, because the Russians are in excellent position to negotiate, the Ukrainians are not. But we have 60 days still when Biden, has his finger on the nuclear button, and Biden, multiple experts designated him as cognitively impaired. So we're in a very perilous situation.
This perspective underscores how leadership plays a critical role in navigating such crises. The unpredictability attributed to Trump is seen by some as a strategic advantage, while Biden's perceived cautiousness has drawn criticism.
The Russian military-industrial complex is right now working on a 24/7 basis, 3 shifts a day, pumping out those missile systems. Why is that? It's because Putin has transitioned the Russian military and economy on a wartime footing 7 years prior to invading Ukraine. And I personally briefed NATO, Obama's White House, National Security Council, STRATCOM, EUCOM, and all of these key pieces of the U.S. national security community about what was coming, right, at the highly classified level. And yet, what the Pentagon has decided to do is use Ukraine effectively as a human shield to protect the Europeans who didn't want to pay for their own security.
Koffler's account paints a grim picture of Russia's long-term preparation for war and the strategic challenges faced by the West. The suggestion that Ukraine is being used as a buffer raises questions about how the conflict has been managed from the outset.
I recommend that the ruling elites of those countries that are hatching plans to use their military contingent against Russia seriously think about this.
This dangerous brinkmanship is compounded by the criticism directed at Western leadership, as many argue that a lack of clear, proactive strategy has allowed the situation to spiral. Rebecca Koffler's analysis points to a stark reality.
What the Pentagon has decided to do is use Ukraine effectively as a human shield to protect the Europeans who didn't want to pay for their own security.
Such comments force us to confront the harsh realities of modern warfare and global politics. Amidst this chaos, the resilience of the Ukrainian people and the shifting geopolitical landscape have brought NATO closer together and awakened Europe to the dangers of complacency. Yet, with Putin's ambitions far from quelled and the possibility of further escalation always on the table, the stakes have never been higher. Can the international community find a way to navigate this treacherous path and achieve lasting peace? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.